Yep. You're on. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight's Planning and Zoning Commission meeting of June 17th, 2019. Action items on tonight's agenda. We have 2 public hearings, 2 letters of recommendation, 1 information report, and another item. And we're going to establish the nominating committee for officers for the upcoming year. So let's welcome everybody here, and please remember to silence your cell phones for entered portion of the public sessions. Mr. Newberry, can we have a roll call of members?
Commissioner Hofrey, Commissioner Levitt,
Here.
Commissioner Cohn,
Here.
Commissioner Gragnani,
Here.
Commissioner Beatty,
Here.
Commissioner Deppler,
Here.
Commissioner Simpson,
Here.
Councilmember Werther,
Present.
Mayor Bolin,
Here.
Chair Lee.
Present. Can I have an approval or of the minutes from last meeting? Commissioner Cohn? Commissioner Gragnani, second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Passes. Does the department have any opening remarks? Mr. Newberry, who leads us to the public comment session. Do we have any speaker cards?
Yes, sir. I have 1 card for the public comment session. Councilmember Gragnani.
Okay, I'm not quite as tall as Councilman Remy. Good evening. I really came up here tonight to do a little educational opportunity for you all. Being a physician, I thought that it might be helpful to give you some information. I understand, and I'll preface my comments first by saying that I understand that you're going to be talking about the marijuana issue. The state of Missouri obviously is now commissioned to do this by the voters who voted this in last year. But I got to tell you that the whole marijuana thing is somewhat of a problem. It's been a problem in some of the states that passed marijuana, especially for recreational use. And I hope that that doesn't happen here in Missouri, but it might. But just to give you an idea of what I'm going to be trying to address to you all, and the reason for this is so that you understand that you need to keep this stuff out of the heart of the city and away from our children and our churches, okay? I mean, it's not a nice item. You wouldn't put a liquor store right next to a school. You wouldn't put this next to a school either. There's an agency, online, and you can look it up yourself. It's called the Cochrane Reviews, Cochrane, Cochrane. It's been around for many, many years. It's a repository of scientific information that's collected by physicians and sent in by physicians for various studies that are done throughout the world on various topics. And marijuana has been one of the topics that's been presented to this database or this library of information. I pulled 4 items. There's not a lot of studies that have been done, really. There's not much that's been done with marijuana, but there are 4 items here that have been touted recently as being helpful with the use of marijuana. And I got to tell you that the articles make it very clear after review of all of the cases that they have in their possession that they came up with the following conclusions. The first one here says that no evidence that cannabinoids, that's tetrahydrocannabinol, the basic ingredient of marijuana, are effective in the improvement of disturbed behavior in dementia or in the treatment of other symptoms of dementia, which has been touted to be one of the things it's useful for. It doesn't do that. Here's another one. I hear this one all the time. I've talked to people at the hospital periodically who claim that they've used marijuana to treat their epilepsy. It's not efficacious in epilepsy, actually. It says epilepsy is a disorder. They describe it. It says marijuana or cannabinoids may be one such agent that is an agent that might be used as an agent for seizures. It says this review assessed the efficacy of marijuana or cannabinoids as a treatment for epilepsy. No reliable conclusions can be drawn at present regarding the efficacy of cannabinoids as a treatment for epilepsy. Further trials are needed. So that's another one that's a popular thing that people talk about. And then there's one here that the use of medical marijuana, cannabinoids, to improve the appetite in patients with HIV and AIDS. And also the conclusion is that at present, it says there is insufficient data available at present to justify wide-ranging changes to the current regulatory status of cannabis or synthetic cannabinoids in the use of that condition. And lastly, and most importantly, there's an article here about school-based prevention for illicit drug use. This particular article deals with the effects that the marijuana has as an entry-level drug in the school system, and that it promotes the entitlement of young people to move from one type of drug to another. They give a list of four items that are of concern to them in this particular article. I can make this available to you because I think this one is probably useful to refer to. So in the final analysis of all of this, what am I getting at with you is what I said when I started out. Keep this stuff at bay. We can't stop it because it's the law now in the state of Missouri to put these things and make these things available, but I think that it's up to us and the local communities to be sure that we control this so it does not get out of control. And that's pretty much what I wanted to tell you. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Commissioner Cohn?
Yeah, I'd like to add a little something about the marijuana and the legality of it. As we all know, it's illegal according to the federal government, which goes into banks that are FDIC insured. They cannot finance or allow that type of use in any building where they have a loan. So the likelihood of an existing building being able to lease to a dispensary is highly unlikely. Not only will it be violation of any loan on the property, but when they go to sell it, if they desire to, they won't be able to get a loan, nor will they be able to get title insurance. So it's a difficult thing to happen, but I realize it is part of Missouri state law.
Seeing no other comments, no other speaker cards?
Not for the public comment session. We do have a few for the public hearings.
Okay. I'll go ahead and read the public hearing script, and then we'll get started with that. In the city of Wildwood, public hearings are truly intended to accept comments and questions concerning these items. Since this is a public hearing, it is only intended to provide information on these requests. No action is planned on these items tonight, and consideration of them is to be taken no earlier than July 15th, 2019. The city's Department of Planning will address the comments, questions, and concerns that are raised tonight and include them as part of their formal recommendation to the Planning and Zoning Commission. Public hearings are conducted as described in the handout provided on the table in the reception area, along with information on these matters. The Commission will allow all parties adequate time to present their position and ask that you respect all opinions by other speakers and avoid interrupting anyone during their time at the podium. Anyone wanting to speak or receive future information on these items should fill out a speaker's card and leave it with Mr. Newberry. In addition, information on these items can be found on the city's website at www.cityofwildwood.com. The Commission would like to thank you for your cooperation and participation in tonight's hearings. Mr. Vunich.
I'll read it into the record, sir. PZ 8-19, Albert and Gisela Boehner, 18909, Old Foxbridge Road, Wildwood, Missouri, 63069, care of Straight Up Solar, 10330, Page Industrial Boulevard, St. Louis, Missouri, 63132. A request for a conditional use permit in the NU Non-Urban Residence District and FPNU FPNU Floodplain Non-Urban Residence District. Street address 18909, Old Foxbridge Road, locator number 26Y120115, for the installation of roof-mounted solar panels, which are to be situated on the dwelling as to be visible from the adjoining roadway. This request is to be reviewed in accordance with Chapter 415.090 NU Non-Urban Residence District Regulations of the City of Wildwood Zoning Ordinance, which establishes standards and requirements for the installation of solar panels The requested permit is required due to the panel's placement on the front-facing area of the dwelling's roof, which does abut a roadway, Ward 6.
Thank you, Mr. Newberry. Mr. Vunich.
Mr. Chair and members of the Planning and Zoning Commission, due to the fact that this request involves a conditional use permit, the Department of Planning would like to introduce into the record the following items. Chapter 415 of the City of Wildwood Municipal Code, the zoning ordinance, the file that has been developed and maintained regarding this particular request, PZ 8-19, and any testimony that may be offered tonight as part of this hearing. Mr. Chair, with your permission, I believe Mr. Newberry has a brief slide presentation he can provide at this time.
Mr. Newberry.
This is an aerial view of the subject site. You can see it's south of southeast of State Route 100. Further to the south is Rockwood's Reservation. It's not shown here, but that's what's located farther to the south. This is a photograph looking I guess to the south on Old Foxbridge Road, where the property is located, abutting. This is the front of the petitioner's home. Later in the slide presentation will be a configuration of the proposed solar panels. And then this is a view sitting at the same location on the private road, looking at the neighbor's property. And here. That concludes the department's presentation. I can pull up the configuration of the solar panel. I didn't make it into this presentation for some reason, so apologize for that.
Could you pull that up and we could see? Mr. Vunich.
Mr. Chair, while Mr. Newberry works with our technology to address the remaining slides, the department would like to make a couple of points in regards to this particular request before the petitioner is invited to the podium. First, as you know, the rationale behind a conditional use permit for certain solar panel installations relate to a request many requests, in fact, from residents in other locations throughout the city that had experienced problems with the same, meaning that solar panels were installed just as typical structures. They created issues relative to compatibility to the neighboring properties, and the Planning and Zoning Commission recommended, City Council concurred, that a more stringent process was necessary. Secondly, and probably more, as you know, the rationale behind a conditional use permit for certain solar panel installations relate to a request many requests, in fact, from residents in other locations throughout the city. I'm sure you all looked at the one slide and said that the lot is heavily treed. Solar panels were installed just how could be visible from the abutting roadway. Issues relative more so than that, the department would reference the last discussion we held on solar panels. Recommended City Council relative to a front-facing toward a street, and the issue became the two trees. How long they would be there? Would they be removed? Would they not be removed? Etc. And so from the department's perspective, it understands that this is a different situation, but the situation is such that consistency, at least with regards to not taking into account tree cover necessarily, is important. And so that's why we've asked the petitioner to come forward tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Vunich. Does the petitioner want to speak on their behalf?
My name is Valerie Corey. I work for Straight Up Solar, and I am here to speak on this to any questions you may have. I mean, I can explain the project a little more. I mean, it consists of 23 LG 320 solar modules, 1 solar edge, 6,000 inverter, and it's on Iron Ridge racking. The mods are black framing with black backsheet, and it's on black rails, so it's all going to be black on black on black on the roof.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll open it for discussion. Mayor Bolin.
So Travis, are we getting close to seeing that?
Mr. Mayor, it's on the screen now. It's difficult to read because the lines are dark.
While you're doing that, I just have a, oh, I see. Here we go. So, Joe, then if I may, I have a question for you. By virtue of this being a request for a CUP, I take that to mean this is an exception to the rules that the city passed relative to solar panels being visible
The preference
to the roadway and other residents and so forth.
Right. The preference is that they be either mounted on the rear of the dwelling, not visible from a road, or at the very least to the side. The Planning and Zoning Commission, when approving the addition of solar panels as a conditional use permit, said that those that were front-facing were not necessarily an exception, but required greater scrutiny.
So, Mr. Vunich, by nature of this, it's facing the street. That's why it's up here for CUP.
Again, just so as everybody is clear, a lot must have a front yard setback and typically side and rear yard setbacks. Not all lots have 2 side yards, but all lots have a front, side, and rear yard setback area. The determination of front yard is made by the greater distance in the setback, which is 50 feet for front yards in the non-urban resident district. And so that's how the determination is made. Wherever the easement is located, the front yard is the area abutting the easement. And again, some lots have 2 front yards, and even some have 3. Those are the folks that struggle.
Commissioner Levitt.
Mr. Vunich, I don't know if, I assume you've read the meeting comment form from Pete Margolf, who evidently is the neighbor directly across the street. And he comments that even in the winter, the house is difficult to see because of the way it's set. I just wanted to know your opinion on his statements.
Well, and again, the placement of the house relative to the front yard area is permanent, more so than any tree cover. And so from that perspective, the placement up a hill, slightly shielded by a ridge, those kinds of things certainly play into it. And a more liberal interpretation by the department probably could have precluded this. But again, the department recognizes, as it stated, that the requirement for such came from complaints about installations that, for all intents and purposes, were compliant to the code. And that wasn't enough. The City Council and the Planning and Zoning Commission identified that. And not that trees are temporary, but any tree can be hit by lighting, any tree can become diseased, any tree can be removed by the owner. And then there's the potential for visibility. In this particular case, it's a very secluded location. The likelihood of anyone seeing it is very, very limited. But from the perspective of the department, it makes its recommendation somewhat easier to formulate. And certainly, once formulated, if favorable, the property owner then would not ever have to basically be concerned that, the determination might be reviewed at some point in the future. So it's a bit of security for all parties, and we appreciate the comment letter. It makes it, again, very easy for us to make a determination, I think, in the end.
And
Commissioner Levin.
do I understand that some of the installations in the past that raised that visibility in question were even pole mounted versus roof mounted?
That actually was the hair that broke the camel's back. They were ground mounted, facing toward the neighbor's property. It was a southerly direction in terms of the panels facing, but certainly created quite a problem, and we're just trying to avoid that problem in the future.
Thank you.
Mayor Boland.
Joe, is this property part of a subdivision?
Yes.
I think, and I definitely appreciate the intent of what they're trying to accomplish, and I appreciate the letter from someone who lives nearby, but it seems to me this involves everyone in the subdivision, and I guess I'd be curious whether the subdivision as a whole has any issue with this.
We can certainly contact the subdivision trustees as soon as we find out who they are. And if it's not too large of a subdivision, we have a month to send a letter and ask for their opinions.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner
Chair.
Grignani.
To speak to that issue a bit, I did go out to the property late this morning, and I only saw 3 houses, maybe 4. I can't remember for sure. There was one before it, and then the one across the street I saw, and I'm not sure if there was one at the very end or not. So it is, as Mr. Vunich says, it's a very secluded place. Yeah, I think I see 3 houses on that street, and it's a ways off of Fox Creek Road. So as has been said, the only people who are going to see it are the 2 other houses on the street. And the one across the street, there's a bunch of trees. If he goes up his driveway and around behind trees to get to his house, I don't see it as a problem here, but I see the need for having the CUP because in high-density subdivisions where people put them on the front side of their house, there's the potential for issues to occur. So on this one, I personally don't see any problem with it at all.
Commissioner Simpson.
I could be wrong. I've been wrong once before. In reading through all that information, I could swear I read that it was already approved by the subdivision.
I believe Mr. Newberry collects the comment. I'll defer to...
The comments the department received were included in the packet, so it's just that one letter. I would also add that the department has requested a letter from the trustees and hasn't received it yet, but it has been requested.
Okay.
Well, in accordance with the mayor's request and to verify what Ms. Simpson has said, if the subdivision is just 3 lots, we'll just send a letter to each of them and advise them that the Planning and Zoning Commission wanted to hear their opinion, collective opinions on the placement, and that if they'd like to participate, it'll be back at a hearing sometime in July.
Thank you, Mr. Brunich. Are there any other discussion points? Anybody in the audience want to speak on this? Seeing none, let's close that public hearing. Second by Mayor Boland. Grignani on the recommendation. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Moving on. Mr. Newberry, will you read PZ 11-19?
Yes, sir. PZ 11-19, City of Wildwood Planning and Zoning Commission, care of Department of Planning, 16860 Main Street, Wildwood, Missouri 63040. A request to review Section 415.030 definitions, Section 415.400 sign regulations general, Section 415.410 sign regulations for FP, PS, NU, and all R districts, Section 415.420 sign regulations for all C and M districts, Section 415.430 subdivision information signs, and Section 415.440 temporary signs, specifically for the purposes of considering possible changes to certain existing regulations to address comments and concerns from members of the public regarding their timeliness and applicability, and to review recent relevant legal developments regarding the same. All words.
Thank you, Mr. Newberry. Mr. Vunich.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair and members of the Planning and Zoning Commission, the particular item that Mr. Newberry read into tonight's record relates to the city's sign regulations, collectively all of the city's sign regulations. As you may recall, earlier this year, two specific areas of the sign regulations were presented to the Planning and Zoning Commission for consideration. Ultimately, changes were authorized or recommended by the Planning and Zoning Commission to them, and ultimately were not supported by City Council. As part of that discussion, the City Council has requested a more comprehensive review of the sign regulations at this time. Acknowledging that comprehensive nature of the review, the department would note that the City Attorney, John Young, has provided a great deal of background relative to certain aspects of our sign regulations recently. So he will be integral in the discussion of this particular petition, as well as the preparation of any potential changes recommended by the Planning and Zoning Commission. And the department would recommend you use him as well as us as a resource tonight during the public hearing if there are specific questions, concerns, or comments. As mentioned, the Department of Planning and the City Attorney have been discussing sign regulations for an extended period of time. I mentioned briefly that earlier this year, two specific changes were presented to the Planning and Zoning Commission and favorably recommended. That process actually started in 2018. The impetus for that process to start in 2018 were questions raised by certain residents about the legality of certain regulations relating to the use of the city's public right-of-way areas and living signs. The City Attorney and the Department of Planning believed it was appropriate not just to look at those two, but to take that opportunity in 2018 and review all of the sign regulations more comprehensively. The Planning and Zoning Commission may ask, well, why? If there were specific issues, why broaden the review if not necessary? And that is where the United States Supreme Court steps in. In 2016, they rendered a decision relating a small community in the state of Arizona. And although a number of dissenting opinions and other briefs were offered by the collective group of 9 justices, the outcome of that decision was that signs cannot be regulated based on their content. They must be content neutral. And a problem the city of Wildwood has is oftentimes we call our signs by their purpose, their content, business signs, information signs, directional signs. I can assure you there is no nefarious reason for that. It just makes logical sense. And so from that perspective, the United States Supreme Court said we need to look at how we call our signs and ensure that we're referencing our sign regulations not on content, but content neutral and from a public safety aspect. So the primer goes into detail relative to what cities can regulate relative to signs based upon a question one of the justices responded to. And certainly there are ways to regulate signs. And those ways are what I think is the basis of the start of our discussion tonight and any discussions that follow relative to the department's information report and finally the letter of recommendation. I would note also that the city has not just stood pat with its sign regulations. It's always been cognizant that this particular area of regulation creates the most angst amongst residents, businesses, institutional users, etc. And from the department's perspective, maybe one of the most difficult enforcement issues it faces on a day-to-day basis. So signs are tough. We've always known that. We've known that from day one when we inherited St. Louis County's regulations. But we've always looked at them from the perspective of purpose. In town center, what purpose do we want signs to provide? Outside town center, in our residential areas, the more suburban locations, what purpose should the signs provide? And then finally, in our non-urban resident district areas, what purpose? It's interesting, in the non-urban resident areas, we have a lot of institutional uses. So in those locations, we actually have much more signage than you would typically expect. So tonight, the department doesn't necessarily have a list of recommended changes. That will be prepared for what I believe will be a subsequent meeting. Maybe not where the information report is presented, but more of a work session so we can kind of dig into the details. But first and foremost tonight, we want to hear from the Planning and Zoning Commission members and the residents about what they think of the current sign regulations. Acknowledging again that they must be content neutral and that they must not necessarily be regulated on their purpose. So from that perspective, I leave you a broad and open field to start the discussion tonight. Thank you. Oh, Mr. Chair, if Mr. Young would like to add anything at this time, I'd be glad to yield the microphone.
Mr.
I have nothing to add at the moment.
Mr. Newberry, do we have any speaker cards?
Yes, sir. One speaker card for Miss Sheely.
Hi, I'm Karen Sheely, Ward 5. A few months ago, I spoke to the council when this issue came before them, the first pass. And at the time, I made this point. Most of you should know, it's in the news, that the city is involved in a lawsuit related to signage and the 2018 election, I think it is. My point back then was that I think it's changing the sign laws right now is very inappropriate because of the lawsuit. Now, why do I say that? In the past, at times when, in the lawsuit involves obviously the mayor and a couple council people. In the past, when the council people and the mayor were under investigation, the council passed an ordinance that was in direct conflict with the charter. Okay, I didn't think that could happen. I didn't think you could have laws that conflicted with the charter, which is the law of your city. But they did, and that specific law that they changed was related to the accusations at the time. Okay, so even though the charter sections were approved by the Charter Commission, the law was passed and it exists right now and is in conflict with the charter. But it gave the people who were under investigation the political cover to say, hey, look, here's the law. And if the average citizen goes out then and looks at that law, they see the new law. They don't see the law that was in place back when the transgression occurred. So it's very difficult from a public standpoint, maybe not in legal court, but in the public standpoint to have a citizen make a fair judgment because they don't see all that history. So I'm here tonight to sort of make that same point. All I want for this city is fairness, openness, and justice for everyone, not just for a few people, for everyone. I would like to see the charter upheld, and I would like to see ordinances not passed that are in violation of the charter. Passing this law right now is a slippery slope because of what's going on. And I'm not going to sit here and say that the sign laws don't need to be reviewed or possibly changed. I'm not hard over like that. Obviously, things change. There's always going to be, like Joe mentioned, yin-yang between different facets of the people in the city. But what I'm asking right now is that whatever you do and whatever you look at, that you be very careful with respect to that issue. The one point about what was provided to you tonight by Joe and I guess Mr. Young is the comment on the second page that's bringing up all these points about what we need to review. But if you read the first sentence, it says, although many view the 2015 Supreme Court case to severely restrict the authority of cities, individual or collective opinions of the individual justices on the court, outside of the majority that signed and issued the prevailing opinion on the case, did establish certain components. So that means like there's a very small subset, or I don't even know, maybe one justice who brought up some points and put them out on a piece of paper in an opinion. And that seems to be the opinion that they're referring to here, not the majority. Now, I could be wrong. I'm not a lawyer. And I would suggest that you talk to Mr. Young and ask him that question. So, where does this really fall down? Are these points really the majority? Is this what the Supreme Court's telling us? Or is this points from one justice? Okay? So it's just things like that come through here that you see, okay, that I'm asking you to consider. Right? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments.
No more speakers, sir. Speaker cards.
I'll open for discussion. Mayor Boland?
So through the chair to the city attorney, John, that's a fairly serious accusation relative to an ordinance that we've adopted that violates the charter. To your knowledge, have we adopted an ordinance since you've been city attorney that violates the charter?
I'm not aware of any, Mayor.
Thank you.
Councilman Worthy.
Thank you. Mr. Vinich.
Yes, sir.
Since we are now in a position, at least based on the Arizona case, that content, obviously, let alone naming a sign of what its purpose is, can't be done. Are we stuck then with naming a sign type, meaning a sale sign? And when I mean sale, I mean SAIL, that we see, kind of the banners hanging from these days. A fixed sign in terms of post type or some sort of way of fixing it, whether by wire, by wooden post, something along those lines, or are we having to come up with new categories here? And the other reason I bring it up, because it was part of a discussion I had earlier today with a group of folks, there's also a case with Belnor, the city of Belnor here. I think it's still in the federal appeals court at this point, and they seem to have created what they thought was a very simple, straightforward ordinance, but now that's even in question, if I recall correctly.
The Belnor case that you're talking about, the 8th Circuit about a month ago, reversed and remanded.
Yeah.
The lower court had agreed with the village. So yeah, that's something that we're analyzing and reviewing in light of what we're doing here today.
Okay. So obviously, if we can include that, not necessarily in the analysis, but I guess a summary of both the initial ruling and then the appeals court that remanded it back. Because there, as I recall, Belnor basically said, okay, sign content neutral. It could be of this size. It could have content on either side of the sign. It had to be so far away from the street or sidewalk, but it limited it to one sign per property. So, and I don't know the particulars, but I know enough to realize, okay, could be any number of issues there. 1, in terms of size, 2, in terms of placement, 3, in terms of the number of signs being allowed on a particular property. So all those, I think, need to be part of our considerations. On a separate point entirely, trying to get away from the legal aspects, Mr. Vinich, I know we've taken a run at it a number of times. LED signage. You smile and grimace, I know. are we in a position to take that particular subject back up? Because I know we still have a number of institutional uses and others around the city that have internally lit fluorescent backlit signing. It's not the halo type or anything that would be typical that we would expect or approve. It's just a very basic type of signage. And that the LED signage has advanced to such a degree that the controls surrounding that are much greater than they ever have been. And so my thought is if the department's willing to wade in, I'd be happy to have that discussion again as well on LED signage.
The department is working that front from two perspectives. First, as you know, as a council person, we are ready to engage Randy Burkett Lighting Design to help us understand better the dynamics of LED lights themselves. They are very different than anything that we've described in our outdoor lighting requirements, which are part of the city's zoning ordinance, and that is the greatest shortfall of our outdoor lighting requirements. That is about to get started. So from that perspective, this might be an opportune time.
Okay, and let's not limit it, if possible, to just the outdoor lighting requirements. We see so many businesses take advantage of LED, I'll call it monitors for lack of a better term, because that's really essentially what they are, LED monitors, and treat them as signage by placing those outward facing on the windows and glasses in their businesses. So I think obviously we have to include all that. Treat it differently, but have to be included as part of all this. Thank you.
Mayor Boland.
So I have a question, but before I ask a question, Joe, relative to LED, it's my understanding that the LED signage is essentially what, in large measure, we've seen as we travel up and down Manchester and Ellisville and Baldwin and so forth. The new fad and trend in signage that lights and the signs can change by programming and so forth. Is that correct?
Yes, we've had a discussion about electronic message boards, which are premised solely on LED lighting. The department was not going to bring that back because I think the message from the Planning and Zoning Commission was clear when they denied it.
Right. So my question through the chair to Councilor Ward there, I just want to be clear I understand what you're advocating. Are you advocating that we allow LED signs in the city of Wildwood?
I'm not advocating one way or the other, sir. And it's a false accusation to even go that far.
I'm just
the fact of the matter, I have the floor. The fact of the matter is that this is this ever-changing area of signage. We have in the last, let's see, I know in the last few months of when I was mayor, we had several high schools back here asking about LED signage and replacing that with other concessions, because right now, look at even elementary schools, they go ahead and take, I don't know what they're using these days, but they taking advantage of their fencing and weaving things into it to provide logos and other things, which is essentially signage.
It is.
And so we have to have a way to try and address this some way, shape, or form. The issue before was that Lafayette High School uses the example. The trade-off could have been the addition of an LED sign in place of where the current Lafayette High School sign is, and the prohibition of all other signs that would have been placed on campus. That would have included all the little yard signs that are about the size, 2 feet by 3 feet, that advertise mattress sales for fundraisers, the carnivals, the band practices, the various events, the plays, and so forth. So the opportunity there exists to go ahead and reduce the overall clutter in some degree if we get the proper controls on the LED side. Now, I know Ms. Grignani was here, I think Mr. Lee, both Mr. Cohn and Mr. Beatty were here perhaps the last time we had this discussion. And I think it warrants it to have the discussion. And let's talk through it again and figure out if there's some value to this. If we're going to go ahead and take a comprehensive look at our sign ordinances, we need to keep an open mind. And I think that includes LED signage.
Joe, I have a statement, I guess, question. Sure. However you want to do it. LED is a light emitting diode It has nothing to do with an animated movement sign. You can get LEDs that look like they're fluorescent bulbs. So as we go further with this, the light source, we need to separate as technology, and I don't think we should write any of that out, because in 10 years there's going to be some new technology that will replace LEDs. If we're going to talk about animated message boards and strike that out of our ordinance, then that's the term I would propose that we use. As far as LED lights in buildings, most buildings are going LED and they're replacing all their fluorescent fixtures, and they go in the same ballast, and it's an LED lamp that will last years. And I think that's some technology that all the sign companies are going to have. So I don't want to have LED in your write-up as something that we don't want to do. So let's get the technology separated from what we're trying to accomplish, which is the animated sign.
And the department concurs wholeheartedly. The lighting consultant will address the department's principal concerns about brightness levels. Because when I see a sign application now that says 10 watts and it's an LED, my first impression is, well, that's not a bright light. I am completely wrong. So there's an understanding that I think we need to incorporate into our outdoor lighting requirements relative to the LED lighting. So from that perspective, we're treating that separately. How it's applied in signs, there are the electronic message boards, which we've discussed in the past, and the Planning and Zoning Commission didn't support. But there are also smaller applications, window signs, that we're seeing as well. And those are the ones I think that are probably most prevalent right now, because we do not allow electronic message boards.
Mayor Bowen.
As part of the analysis, I'd like to ask, without objection, that the city attorney provide the commission with an analysis of, should that box be opened, exactly what the ramifications could be relative to LED signage throughout our city that we're seeing in other cities. Thank you.
Commissioner Levitt.
I think related to that, I understand not commenting on current legal matters, but I appreciate and am supportive of Mrs. Shealy's suggestion that any decisions or final recommendations of this commission be postponed until that legal matter is resolved.
Mr. Young?
For what it's worth, from the city attorney's perspective, I'm not concerned about moving forward, even with the pending litigation.
Mr. Boonage?
And this isn't going to happen overnight. There's a lot to research, so we'll do our best to keep it moving forward. But if we have a work session to kind of delve a little deeper into some of the components, we have to basically think about how we rename certain signs so they're not basically content-based. And then there's always the process of presenting it all back to the Planning and Zoning Commission and the community. So we'll keep ourselves busy through the summer and probably early fall with this particular item. And hopefully by that time, the question regarding the lawsuit will be resolved.
One thing, another comment. I travel quite a bit across the country, see lots of different sign ordinances and so forth, and the majority of them are based on whether they're permanent or temporary. Temporary would have a time limit on it. And then regulations happen by size of the sign, and it's usually dependent on street frontage or size of building or type of building. And then they can have number of signs on the building depending on what street frontage you have. And then most signs are either regulated by their box, and they're internally lit, which means you see the color, or they're backlit, or sometimes they have no lighting and then an uplight on them. But there's always a lighting ordinance that goes with it. So the LED component and the brightness of it, we can limit that based on an equivalent illuminance. So if that's what we're after, then that's what we should do. As far as the content, you cannot regulate the content of the sign. If you have a business or, somebody wants to take out a temporary sign permit application. In all cases, there's always a permit required for both.
Much of what you just described is currently in our sign regulations, particularly the permitting requirement. I do have just one other item. I had mentioned that as part of the Supreme Court's decision, they did identify where local governments might be able to regulate signs. And there was a question from the public speaker about, was it just one of the justices that basically provided the feedback, so to speak, for local governments? According to the case, it was Justice Alito, Justice Kennedy, Justice Sotomayor on the writings of Justice Breyer. So 4 of the 9 took the time to basically provide the rules that local governments might consider. Mr. Chair, we have the option to keep the public hearing open. I don't know if it's necessary. But again, I think the next step is for Mr. Newberry, Mr. Young, and I to put together some ideas about direction and then maybe hold a work session if that's acceptable to the rest of the commission members.
I'm game to keep it open and let's have a work session.
I think so too,
There's a lot to grapple with.
until they come back with some preliminary information for us, and I think we should be able to go through that and then have a public hearing to allow any public comment.
Okay. Let's just do a voice vote to keep the public hearing open.
I would need a motion and second to hold the public hearing open.
Councilman Werther and second by Greg Nani. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Any abstentions?
Abstaining.
All right, moving on. We have 3 items for consideration, letters of recommendation. Mr. Newberry, will you read PZ 5-19?
PZ 5-19, City of Wildwood Planning and Zoning Commission, care of Department of Planning, 16860 Main Street, Wildwood, Missouri 63040. A request relating to PZ 10-15, St. Charles Tower, care of Catherine Roderick, 4 West Drive, Suite 100, Chesterfield, Missouri 63017, which, if granted, would terminate the conditional use permit that was authorized on this 10.6 acre tract of land, of which 2,000 square feet of this total lot's area is permitted to be utilized for 110-foot telecommunications tower and related equipment shelter area in Yunnan Urban Residence District with the conditional use permit, generally located northwest of the intersection of Babler Park Drive and Old Etherton Road. Locator number 21W310270, street address 1400 Babler Park Drive, Life Point Church. This review relative to the termination of this existing permit is required given it contains certain performance standards for submittals which have not been met, along with the petitioner notifying the City of Wildwood that it does not intend to complete the required site development plan process in the timeline therein established by the Planning and Zoning Commission and the governing permit. Ward 3.
Thank you, Mr. Newberry. Mr. Vunich.
Mr. Chair and members of the Planning and Zoning Commission, before the department begins its brief presentation on this draft letter of recommendation, I do want to extend an apology. The date and action on the information report, which is part of the cover sheet, reflects that Councilmember Werther voted in the affirmative. Actually, Councilmember Werther abstained.
Thank you.
The abstention related to his current employment in the telecommunications field. So I caught that as I was standing here, and my apologies.
I was looking at it this afternoon and realized it was out of sync with the minutes.
So again, my apologies to all of you. We'll correct that in the final draft if approved by the Planning and Zoning Commission. Mr. Chair and members of the Planning and Zoning Commission, at the June 3rd, 2019 meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission, the department presented its information report with recommendation on this request to terminate an existing conditional use permit that would authorize a 110-foot telecommunications tower with equipment shelter area. The rationale for the termination is that the petitioner has not met certain performance standards relating to timeline and submittals. The petitioner, with the last request for an extension of time to continue the conditional use permit forward, even noted that it was not their intent to prepare a site development plan until a provider had committed to the tower location. With that acknowledgement, the Planning and Zoning Commission did not support the extension of time, and also at that same meeting authorized the public hearing for termination to proceed. The department supported the termination of the conditional use permit, and the the Planning and Zoning Commission concurred. The vote was 6-0 with 1 abstention. With that action, the department has converted the information report to authorship of the Planning and Zoning Commission, and now tonight the draft is ready for final consideration and action by the members. After a motion or second, the chair opens the floor for discussion. The department will be available to answer any questions and respond to your comments. Thank you.
Is there a motion on the department's recommendation? Commissioner Grignani?
I'll make a motion to accept the department's recommendation.
Second, Commissioner Beatty? Councilman Worther?
Thank you. Just again, for the record, I'll go ahead and abstain from voting on this particular matter, as I am also employed within telecommunications industry. Thank you.
I'll make a note on my.
All right, let's do a roll call vote.
Commissioner Levitt?
Yes.
Commissioner Cohn?
Yes.
Commissioner Gragnani?
Yes.
Commissioner Beatty?
Yes.
Commissioner Depler?
Yes.
Commissioner Simpson? Councilmember Werther?
Abstain.
Mayor Boland? Yes, sir. It was a motion to accept the draft letter of recommendation.
Yes.
And Chair Lee?
Yes.
Mr. Newbeer, we'll move to the second item, PZ 9-19.
PZ 9-19, Graham Oswald, 1827 Shiloh Woods Road, Wildwood, Missouri 63005, is seeking the review and action of the Planning and Zoning Commission regarding an outdoor game court, batting cage with associated netting structure, which has already been constructed and located at 1827 Shiloh Woods Road, Wildwood, Missouri, locator number 22X220070 in Yunnan Urban Residence District. In Yunnan Urban Residence District. This request is to be reviewed in accordance with Chapter 415.090 in Yunnan Urban Residence District Regulations of the City of Wildwood Zoning Code, which establishes standards and requirements for outdoor game courts relating to their considerations by the Planning and Zoning Commission. The completed outdoor game court addition, i.e. batting cage, is situated on the south side of the existing residence and placed outside of the front yard setback area, which does constitute an accessory use to the single-family dwelling, Ward 1.
Thank you, Mr. Newberry. Mr. Vunich.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair and members of the Planning and Zoning Commission, the Department of Planning has prepared for your consideration and action tonight a report with recommendation regarding the outdoor game court that's situated on this existing game court on this property. The game court is a batting cage. The batting cage was constructed without the benefit of city authorization or the required permit. The property owner was advised of such and ultimately led to the submittal of the application that was heard at public hearing approximately 2 weeks ago. The Department of Planning has reviewed the components associated with the existing batting cage, the outdoor game court, and has prepared a favorable recommendation for the Planning and Zoning Commission. The location of the game court is compliant to the requirements associated with such structures. The location, although in the front of the house, is not visible from the street due to the fact of the woodland area that is located between the street and the structure. The trustees of the subdivision, via its president of the association, has submitted a letter in support for this particular outdoor game court. And for the most part, the use of wood and black netting makes it blend into the background more so than other colors or other materials. Therefore, based upon its minimal impact, the support of the subdivision's homeowners association and the compliance to the city's code requirements, the department is recommending favorable consideration tonight. The report provides a great amount of detail regarding the property, characteristics of the outdoor game court, etc., and all of those were used in the development of the department's recommendation. Mr. Chair, with the motion or you opening the floor to discussion, the department will be available to answer any questions and respond to your comments, and thank you.
Can I have a motion on the department's recommendation?
A motion to approve the department's recommendation, and I also have a follow-up question if I get a second.
Okay. Second, Commissioner Beatty. Mr. Worth.
Thank you. Mr. Vunich, just out of curiosity, I know going through items A through G, everything seems to be in compliance, but however, in the paragraph preceding it near the top of page 3, and in the analysis, it talks about meeting all the zoning ordinance, tree manual, sustainable planning guides, and believes it does currently meet the requirements set forth herein, but at a minimum in this regard. I'm trying to rationalize meeting all the kind of ticking the things off down the list, but meeting it at a minimum in this regard. Maybe that you can help explain something to me that I missed.
Well, first and foremost, the petitioner is not proposing any additional landscaping, given the fact that the existing woodlands that surround it, except for a portion next to the driveway, is a sufficient screen and much better than anything that a landscape architect could design, that the petitioner could install, because of the fact that it would take years to achieve what's there. The compliance is based upon what I recall in the Sustainable Planning's Guide is that it says that if existing vegetation can supplement or offset the need, then compliance is met. So there's a catch-all, I believe, as I recall. My memory isn't as good as it used to be. It basically says you don't need to plant if there's already enough there to achieve the same outcome. When the department speaks to minimums, oftentimes, particularly in certain circumstances, we see the minimum requirements met, and that's based upon a number of factors. Oftentimes we see developments or petitioners exceed those because they want to do something that's unique to the particular location. So what the department always is, first and foremost, reviewing is minimum compliance.
Any other discussion? Commissioner Grignani?
Mr. Vunich, I know that potentially he could light this game court in the NU area. Is that not correct?
He certainly could, but there is nothing in this recommendation that would authorize such.
So he would technically have to come back to us.
He would have to amend the existing conditional use permit for the component of lighting, and that would be a posted advertisement, and there would be mailings done to the neighbors, and ultimately the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council would have to concur.
Okay. The other, obviously, the city was not questioned about getting a permit to build it in the first place, so we have that little maybe out there that what he would do. So in light of that, obviously someone must have reported this game court.
That's my understanding. A complaint was made.
We haven't, or at least I haven't seen really any negative comments regarding this, so without lights, I mean, for kids to be out there past dark would be pretty difficult. But I guess I'm wondering about the ping of metal bats against the baseball. And, I mean, are there time limits on usage of this? Or is it whatever the ambient lighting will allow?
Whatever the ambient lighting would allow. And certainly, if someone were out there in late hours or early morning hours, there's always the component of our
Noise
criminal
ordinance.
code with regards to peace disturbance.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome, ma'am.
Commissioner Levitt.
Yeah, so looking at this picture, he already has a baseball diamond. Two parts. I want to verify that in fact has no lighting. Is that correct?
That is my understanding, but Mr. Newberry was out at the site.
It is not lighted.
And I would think we would have the same potential noise from the metal bats hitting balls there as well as in the pitching cage or batting cage. So
Yes. Again, what would apply to the batting cage would apply to the baseball diamond. And if the baseball diamond were to be lit, it would require a conditional use permit.
And to your knowledge, there haven't been any noise complaints about the baseball diamond?
No, the complaint, I believe, was on the existence of the batting cage.
That's correct. It was referencing the batting cage specifically.
But not necessarily, or I should say, we weren't given a rationale for it. It could have been the noise factor, I don't know. But we've had batting cages in the more suburban areas where the issue Commissioner Dragnani identified did exist because of proximity, just a few feet from the house itself, the structure, the batting cage. And we've tried to address those in a different manner than in the non-urban resident district area because of the separation.
Seeing no other discussion items, let's do a roll call vote.
Commissioner Cohn? There's a motion to approve the department's recommendation. Yes. Commissioner Gragnani? Yes. Commissioner Beatty? Yes. Commissioner Depler? Yes. Commissioner Simpson? Commissioner Levitt?
Yes.
Councilmember Werther?
Aye.
Mayor Boland?
Yes.
Chair Lee?
Yes. Thank you.
Moving on, Mr. Newberry, will you read PZ 6-19?
PZ 6-19, City of Wildwood Planning and Zoning Commission, care of Department of Planning, 16860 Main Street, Wildwood, Missouri 63040. A request for the consideration of possible changes to Chapter 415 of the City of Wildwood's Code of Municipal Ordinances that would potentially provide new regulations governing the cultivation, manufacture, transportation, distribution, testing, and sale, dispensary of medical marijuana within any NU non-urban residence district, C commercial district, or M industrial district zoned parcel of ground within the City of Wildwood. The consideration of such is necessitated by the timeline and requirements established in the constitutional amendment that was approved and passed by the voters of Missouri on November 6, 2018 for such activities. Any considerations relating to any possible new regulations associated with these activities are premised upon the City of Wildwood's required protection of the public's health, safety, and general welfare through the application of its zoning and land use regulations, all wards.
Thank you, Mr. Newberry. Mr. Vunich.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair and members of the Planning and Zoning Commission, before the department begins its presentation on its information report, it would like to identify just a couple of issues. First, As you know, during the process leading up to tonight's information report, the department, along with the city attorney, has been providing you draft rules and regulations from the state of Missouri's Department of Health and Senior Services. Those were draft rules and regulations. Ultimately, the Department of Health and Senior Services completed that process, and tonight in your packet are what I would describe as the final rules and regulations from the state of Missouri, as promulgated by that department. So there is new information relative to the state of Missouri. It is also important to note that the state of Missouri has been charged with the primary responsibility to address the sale of medical marijuana to a certain population in the state, and the local governments are unable, in many regards, to prohibit such. Not to say that it cannot be regulated, but the state of Missouri has made it clear that any regulations cannot be unduly burdensome on the allowance. And then finally, a different approach tonight. This subject covers a gambit of emotions, from those that may believe in the benefits of medical marijuana to those that see it as a gateway to recreational marijuana and other drug-related problems associated with what is currently illegal. And from that perspective, the department recognized the controversial nature of this subject and did not prepare necessarily recommended changes to the land use regulations of the city, but first wanted to introduce the approach that the department is considering in this regard, based upon its analysis, investigation of background materials, and its research that it's completed. First and foremost, the department would recognize that Wildwood is somewhat unique relative to the 5 components that have been established for medical marijuana. Many communities do not have large tracts of land that would necessarily lend themselves to the cultivation of the product. Now, cultivation of the product appears to be limited to inside a structure due to the nature of the plant and the fickle nature of our weather patterns and climate. But still, it is a growth of a plant which in many regards is similar to any other crop or product that is grown on a farm for the purposes of sale. The dispensary or the sale of the product obviously is one that is of greatest concern to the department in many regards, because it does have a connotation associated with it. And in Wildwood, we have commercial areas, the town center, our downtown and workplace districts, which can easily accommodate a retail component, just as with any other product or service. The remaining, the transportation, the manufacture, and testing, those all could be considered industrial activities. And as you know, in the Wildwood portion of the Chesterfield Valley, that area was zoned by St. Louis County in 1970 and 1971, M3 Planned Industrial District. So that type of activity, manufacture, testing, and transportation facilities, are all allowable uses in many regards in that now almost 50-year-old ordinance. So again, Wildwood is somewhat unique because of its size, because of its character. It could accommodate all 5 components. Starting with the easier side of the coin, so to speak, the city attorney provided a draft ordinance and for all intents and purposes limited all 5 components of medical marijuana to the industrial district of the master plan, and again the Chesterfield Valley area of Wildwood. The department concurs wholeheartedly with the manufacture, the testing, and the transportation. Those words fit into the descriptions contained in our M1 industrial district and our M3 planned industrial district, and are consistent with the words, the text, the intent of the county ordinance that I've referenced earlier. From that perspective, the city attorney's draft ordinance and the department's recommendation in its information report are identical. Thereafter, though, the department identifies cultivation and sale in 2 different components. Certainly when the department, with the assistance of the city attorney, stood before the Planning and Zoning Commission and identified adult businesses, vape lounges, and tattoo parlors as problematic for town center area and regulated them to the industrial area of Wildwood, it concurred wholeheartedly. There are certain components of those 3 land use types that would not be suitable in the department's opinion for town center or any retail center in town center. The description in the state's rules and regulations relating to dispensaries indicates that there are many requirements relating to how the product is stored, displayed, and accessed into the retail component of the space. Very different than anything else that exists at this time in the city of Wildwood, nor for that fact, I believe, in the state of Missouri. The department believes that there is a place for these types of facilities in the downtown and workplace districts under a conditional use permit. Now, you may say, well, there's a C8 planned commercial district that exists that provides protections through the site-specific ordinance. But the department believes in this particular case a conditional use permit must also be sought. That conditional use permit provides a greater level of scrutiny. Instead of an amendment to an existing C8 planned commercial district, it would be a new review and again could add additional conditions beyond what already exists for the property. In the report, the department goes through a lengthy list of considerations that would be applied as well to ensure that signage, storage, waste would all be controlled to a high degree, consistent with the state and in many regards exceeding the state. Also, the department is recommending that the 1,000-foot rule for any place of worship, any daycare or school be retained and not be reduced. Some communities that were contacted, some of the communities that provided their regulations actually reduced the distance. The department believes the distance is satisfactory at the maximum allowed by the state of Missouri. With that component and with the restrictions that the department is recommending, it believes that there are adequate protections to accommodate a dispensary in the city of Wildwood within the town center area. It's important to note here as well that it is not a general retail business. As referenced in the rules and regulations from the state of Missouri, the doctor must prescribe the medical marijuana to the patient. The patient must have a card and be registered, and before being allowed into the area where the medical marijuana is provided and sold, they must go through a checkpoint or a check procedure. So it's not that someone can just walk in and say, I'd like some. That's not the intent of state law nor the department's support for a dispensary. The complex nature of the regulations from the state of Missouri, in conjunction with the recommended regulations of the city, would, for all intents and purposes, I believe, provide a high level of security, scrutiny, but offer another potential tenant for the city of Wildwood. And if a Wildwood resident is prescribed medical marijuana by a licensed physician, there is a location that is nearby, in their home, near their home, and available. In terms of cultivation, the department thought long and hard on this one as well. For example, there is a business in town, Far Greenhouse, that grows poinsettias and other flowering plants, etc. And for all intents and purposes could be easily converted for the cultivation of medical marijuana. And so from that perspective, the cultivation would occur inside greenhouses or other similar structures. There are security procedures that would have to be in place under the state's rules and regulations. And so from that perspective, the concern was, would it be distinguishable otherwise if you drove by inside a building, enclosed, out of sight? Would the security measures draw attention? Potentially. And so from the perspective of the department, it would only support such under a conditional use permit again, if the security measures did not draw attention to it and were not inconsistent with the natural and built environment. The intent here would be to offer an opportunity for a limited number of property owners in Wildwood to have either a lease or sale of the property, the retention of the property as a large lot, and offer an income-derived business in Wildwood, similar to other farms or farming activities. So to summarize, the department believes that testing, manufacture, and transportation facilities in conjunction with medical marijuana belong in the industrial area of Wildwood. It believes that cultivation and the sale can occur in other locations in Wildwood under a strict set of rules and regulations established through the consideration of a conditional use permit. Although there is evidence from Dr. Gragnani that medical marijuana has a questionable success rate with certain terminal or long-term diseases, chronic pain. Certainly, many states in this country have approved them. The residents of the state of Missouri have authorized them, and I think there needs to be a recognition that although we may not know all of the facts on the benefits or the hazards of medical marijuana, we do know the facts and the hazards of opioids and other pain management treatments. And that if an alternative that isn't as onerous as what we know from opioids is available, and the state of Missouri has authorized it, I think we should address it in a fair and appropriate manner. And the department believes its recommendation has done just that. With that, Mr. Chair, if there is a motion to proceed forward with the development of the regulations premised on the department's recommendation, then certainly the department will be available to answer any questions. If there is no motion, certainly if there is a desire to open it for discussion, you can do so by allowing the floor to be open for such. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vonich. Is there a motion on the floor? Okay. We really don't need a second for that, so we'll go ahead and open for discussion.
Thank you, sir.
Commissioner Levitt.
Could the department provide to us a copy of the Cochrane review that Dr. Gragnani offered, specifically the part of marijuana as an entry-level drug?
With the assistance of Dr. Gragnani, I would be more than glad to provide that to the Planning and Zoning Commission. And in fact, the department would like to review it as well. Thank you.
Commissioner Beatty?
Mr. Vunich, do you happen to have a map of basically the areas that would be included and excluded in the town center currently based on that 1,000-foot buffer?
I do not have a map of the radius, so I think the next step, based upon your comment, Commissioner Beatty, would be to identify all schools, places of worship, and daycare centers located within the confines of town center. Again, we're only talking town center. We're not talking those outliers at Clayton and Strecker Road or at Route 109 and Wild Horse Creek Road.
Mhm.
They are not part of town center, but commercially zoned. And so we can easily prepare that map for your consideration.
All right. Thank you. And then does the community college count as a place of education?
It certainly does.
Okay.
Commissioner Simpson?
Mr. Vunich, in the information for the item that I read, you said that you had consulted with other communities for what they were doing with this. Those are all communities that are within our area. So I feel like it's kind of the blind leading the blind with regard to what we know and what we don't know. Has there been any communication with communities that already have this? You know, a community that would be equal to ours, say in, you know, a Denver suburb or someplace like that.
That is a great suggestion, and when we're concluded with our discussion, the department will respectfully request a postponement unless there's a motion to deny. And we can do that research. We can contact communities that are like Wildwood or close to Wildwood in Oregon, Illinois, Colorado, where medical marijuana has been authorized for a period of time already.
Thank you. One of the things that I had seen personally, and I had mentioned this previously, was a place we used to vacation quite frequently. And when a small town opened, at that time, even 3 dispensaries. And what I saw were, you know, people could go in so easily to a doctor. They could say, I have insomnia, I have a headache, I have a backache, I have whatever, and would get a medical marijuana card like that. And, you know, it's just, I'm not saying that will happen, but I've seen it happen. And it scares me. It just does. And I do agree with, if this can help with the opioid situation, it's a terrible plague in our society. But based on what Dr. Gragnani had said too, we don't know that that's true. I have a friend whose father's dying of cancer, and they were convinced that, you know, this was going to cure his cancer. You know, he's probably got days or weeks to live. And this family put the hope on what they were told by people who were pushing this agenda. And I just don't want Wildwood to fall into that. And I don't see that we're not going to not investigate it, but I've just seen a lot, and so I appreciate it.
Well, your perspective is unique given your background, your employment, your education, and I certainly respect that. And our zoning ordinance cannot address a doctor that does not adhere to what I would consider basic principles of prescribing medication, whether it's marijuana or an opioid for whatever the problem may be that isn't needed. There's a lot of that. You just have to turn on the nightly news or 60 Minutes and you can see that many doctors in many locations across the country have profited from opioids by prescribing them at rates that would, for all intents and purposes, knock down an elephant, more or less a human being. But nothing in our zoning ordinance is going to go to the root of, is the doctor prescribing appropriately or not? What I'm basically saying in the report is that with this Department of Health and Senior Services, its thorough review and the regulations and rules they've promulgated, we're hopeful that the situation in Missouri will be different. I have been told that the state of Missouri modeled their rules and regulations from the state of Ohio. And so, based upon your previous comment, I'm going to try to contact some communities there because, again, I was told that there was a lot of similarities between the approaches between Ohio and Missouri. So, if again we're given the opportunity, we can do some additional research for you.
Councilman Worthy.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Mr. Vinich, I appreciate the write-up that you provided to the Planning and Zoning Commission. At the outset, you stated about taking a conservative approach. And it's clear when you read through the conditions, in particular with related to cultivation, it's going to be very narrow and very limited in terms of possible sites. Mr. Beatty asked for mapping of the sales here in Town Center. We may want to do the same related to cultivation as well, just to go ahead and understand that. But because once you start thinking about, okay, we're talking about non-urban residence areas, minimum of 5 acres, a site that can only be permitted if it's on a public roadway, and it's all of a sudden I'm going, okay, well, that starts knocking out a lot of places pretty darn quickly. And I think that's actually a good thing. We don't want, I think as both protectors of public safety and public health, we've got to balance this out. And I think by being this conservative and this stringent, I think it's important that we follow through on that. So I appreciate that. Finally, I think I heard you say you were looking for a motion to postpone.
Yes, I think the suggestion on the mapping components that came from several of the commission members, the additional research where communities have gone through the cycle, let's say they've been at it for 2-3 years, and they've learned a lot that the state of Missouri has yet to have, that knowledge base, are excellent suggestions. And I admit shamefully that I probably should have thought of those and gotten them to you before I prepared the recommendation. But there is a time frame. The city attorney has mentioned that the applications are being accepted up till, I believe, August. And then from August to January, they'll be reviewed and awarded. In January, the actual sale, all of it starts.
Right.
So we have a little more time. Excuse me again. And so, again, if there's a desire to see additional research, to read the report that's been provided or referenced by Dr. Gragnani, a postponement would be appropriate.
I'll offer the motion to postpone.
We have a motion to postpone, but we have more discussion that I want to bring in here. So Mayor Boland.
Well, since that motion's been made, I really so the discussion would have to be on postponement. I just have a point of information, if I may, through the chair to the city attorney. Relative to, John, the dispensaries and the cultivation and the CUP approach that's being recommended versus an ordinance that would place those on a site-specific basis within our zoning classifications in one of those classifications, such as industrial. My question is, between those two, is the CUP approach the more restrictive, or if it can be done, and I'm not sure that it can, would the zoning classification site-specific approach be more restrictive?
Well, I think it would be a combination of both would be the most restrictive applicable. If you're asking if placing it in industrial versus...
Let me ask it this way. Is the ordinance the recommendation that the department is proposing, is it the most restrictive we can do relative to those two items?
Not having seen the specific language it's done, I can't answer that at this time, but I think the ordinance that was drafted and presented is quite restrictive in its nature.
And does that contain, if I may through the chair, does that contain the CUP approach relative to dispensary and cultivation?
It does have a conditional use permit aspect to it, yes.
Okay, thank you.
If I may, with the permission of the chair, I know we're talking about a motion to postpone. given the schedule last week of different events and requirements, city attorney has not had a lot of time to review the department's report, and I think the postponement would allow that to happen. The department was concerned that it may have stepped too far and created an unduly burdensome process that I would like the city attorney to test and to review. So in the end, we may not be able to do some of the things that I hope we can to ensure the public's health, safety, and welfare. And if that were the case, then I would be the first to say we limit it to the industrial area, all components.
Okay, we have a motion and a second on the floor, but I think there's more discussion that people want to do. So
the postponement is a primary motion, and so
so
any discussion from this point forward has to be on whether or not to postpone.
okay, so let's act on the motion to postpone. Roll call vote.
Keep your questions, though, and your comments.
Commissioner Gragnani? Yes. Commissioner Beatty? Yes. Commissioner Depler?
Yes.
Commissioner Simpson? Yes. Commissioner Levitt?
Yes.
Commissioner Kuhn?
Yes.
Councilmember Worther?
Aye.
Mayor Boland?
Yes.
Chair Lee?
Yes.
Thank you for the
Joe?
opportunity to delve a little deeper into this. The department appreciates it. Mr. Chair, what about a nominating committee?
Okay, so the nominating committee for planning commission officers will be Commissioner Helfrey, Commissioner Gragnani, Commissioner Beatty, and myself.
Thank you all. We appreciate it.
So that's all we have tonight on the agenda. So Joe, do you have any other remarks? Is there anybody that is interested in a position on the planning commission board? Put their name in. Is anybody interested in chair, vice chair, or secretary? Yeah. If so, let me know and we'll work on that.
Mr.
Thank
Chair,
you.
before we adjourn, I do have a couple of items. Commission member Levitt has requested that, given the nature of the commission's business, that he be issued a City of Wildwood email address. So it could be jlevitt@cityofwildwood.com. There is nothing that precludes that. So to the 7 other citizen members, would you like one too? Because we can do it for all of you. And from a record retention perspective, as was noted by City Attorney Young, it's probably a good idea. So any objections? We'll go ahead and get you all assigned a new email to add to about the other 30 you have or so. Objection noted, but you're going to get one anyway. And one last thing, if you show up at the first Monday in July, no one will be here but you. We have the first Monday of July off, so enjoy it and have a nice 4th of July holiday as well.
Can I have a motion to close the public planning commission? Adjourn. Okay. Commissioner Simpson and Councilman Worther. All right. Thank you. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions?
Thank you all very much. We appreciate it.
The comment that I couldn't mention